want to welcome those who also be joining us via YouTube. Whenever you see this video, it's the Moorhead Church of Christ Wednesday evening Bible study. We're studying through the book of Judges. And you know, there's not a book of the Bible that we should ever ignore, because even though they may seem insignificant, they come from the Holy Spirit. Which means we need to appreciate each book of the Bible, because within each book of the Bible, God is revealing truth to us. And so we must appreciate each book in their own right. Some books we take more of a liking to than others, and that's probably to be expected, but they all have value in terms of our lives today in living the Christian life. We're in Judges chapter 15 tonight, and just to sort of give a little bit of attention to what we covered there in Judges 14, the author of the book of Judges shows how God used Samson's poor choice of selecting a wife from the Philistine oppressors to initiate hostilities against the Philistine people who had oppressed them for 40 years. And God was behind that. He's going to use that in order to free his people. And in chapter 15, the Bible writer now shows us really the escalation of Samson's hostilities and how he prevailed against the Philistines. Remember that Samson is so unique in relation to the other judges. Remember, all the previous judges were already alive when they were called really to be a judge of Israel. And in Samson's case, he essentially goes to Manoah's wife and essentially says, you're going to have this son, and he's going to be the next judge. He's going to be essentially born under the Nazarite vow. And that's unique in itself. But also we need to see that unlike all the other judges where you sort of have to kind of come up with an army to fight against their oppressors, Samson's like a one-man army. And essentially he does all the fighting for Israel. And so this is very unique in relation to everything in terms of the judges before him. So we're going to start out reading the first 8 verses of chapter 15. I'm going to ask Brother Ryan if he'll read 1 through 4. And then there's a volunteer to read 5 through 8. Ryan, you want to do that? Okay.
After some days, at the time of the wheat harvest, Samson went to visit his wife with a young bull. And he said, I will go into my wife in the chamber. But her father would not allow him to go in. And her father said, I really thought that you utterly hated her. So I gave her to your companion. Is not her younger sister more beautiful than she? Please take her instead. And Samson said to them, this time I shall be innocent in regard to the Philistines when I do them harm. So Samson went and caught 300 foxes and took torches, and he turned them tail to tail and put a torch between each pair of the tails.
When he had set fire to the torches, he released the foxes into the standing grain of the Philistines, thus burning up both the shocks and the standing grain, along with the vineyards and groves. Then the Philistines said, who did this? And they said, Samson, the son-in-law of the Timnite, because he took his wife and gave her to his companion. So the Philistines came up and burned her and her father with fire. Samson said to them, since you act like this, I will surely take revenge on you, but after that I will quit. He struck them ruthlessly with a great slaughter, and he went down and lived in the cleft of the rock of Edom.
Okay. So we need to remember that the information that's given by the Bible writer, the very last verse of chapter 14, verse 20, Samson has no knowledge essentially of the fact that his wife that he left behind in Timnah has now been given to his companion. So you can imagine how Samson is going to feel about this when he goes back to Timnah to his wife, and he finds out that she has now been given to someone else. You know, after all of the events of chapter 14, we have his wife essentially getting the answer to the riddle out of Samson, giving it to her people, and so he feels betrayed by the wife, and he feels that really the men of his companions essentially cheated because he knew they would never get the answer. And so he left very frustrated, very angry with everybody, his wife. And so he did not bring her to his home in Zorah. And sometime later, after the anger of Samson subsided, he travels back there to visit his wife. The time frame is around the wheat harvest, which is believed, according to Kyle and Dalich, and they're customary to be about April, May, or June time frame. And Samson made his intentions known to his father-in-law. He was there to have sexual relations with his wife. However, the Bible says here that the father-in-law put a stop to it. And he's got some explaining to do. In fact, he probably didn't think Samson was coming back. That's how the situation ended very badly. He had to pay up on the debt. He's angry with his wife. He's angry with these men who cheated. And so all of a sudden, he's got to explain. He's got Samson come back. He's got to explain himself. And that's what we have in verse 2. He says, I really thought that you hated her intensely. So I gave her to your companion. And the whole point seems to be that everything ended very badly. What should have been a wonderful celebration, a 7-day wedding feast, really comes, instead of to a really good end, comes to a very horrible end. And so he's explained to him that, I thought you were done with her. And so essentially, I gave her into the hand of one of your companions instead. And the family probably did this to spare themselves embarrassment, because all of these things have taken place. And so now we have really the father is, I believe, thinking fast on his feet. I mean, here's Samson. He's a pretty strong guy. Maybe we've got to appease the situation here. And so he then turns around and offers the younger sister, and he says she's more beautiful than his wife, and essentially, I'll sort of make it up to you. I'm going to give you your wife's sister. And of course, that doesn't sit well with Samson, because he had all of the intention of coming back. The only problem is apparently the father-in-law and the wife never thought that he was coming back. And so Samson is very unhappy with what's happened here. Samson then says, verse 3, this time I shall be blameless in regard to the Philistines when I do them harm, which seems to suggest that the harm that he did by going to another Philistine city, Ashkelon, and killing 30 men and taking their garments to sort of pay up on his bet, he seems to be indicating that he may not have been blameless in that. And the idea is that he's not at fault for that or innocent. And Arthur E. Kundal and Leon Morris in their Tyndale Old Testament commentary on Judges and Ruth says, Samson refused the offer of his intended bride's younger sister, and deeply offended vowed vengeance upon the Philistines. And his words indicate that he felt completely justified in such a vindictive action. In other words, you guys have this coming, and you're going to get it. And that's exactly what's going to take place. So I'm going to stop here just briefly before I get to verse 4 and see if there's any questions or comments about what's going on here. Okay? Not, we'll press on. Verse 4 says, Samson went and caught 300 foxes and took...
Well, you should
When
you make decisions, and stuff goes ahead of ourselves. When you make a decision, you better make sure it's a good decision.
Right.
Like the saying goes, make sure you you don't need that person before you burn the bridge and stuff. You need to make sure you're not going to get yourself in a lot of trouble when you
Right.
make a decision. But James says, "Be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger," and stuff. you make rash decisions or just assume and stuff, it could get you in a lot of trouble.
Right.
Like this is getting them into trouble because they assumed that everything was gonna go good.
Right.
And it's coming back to haunt them.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
So,
So Samson went and caught 300 foxes and took torches and turned the fox's tail to tail and put one torch in the middle between two tails. Peter would certainly not like this, but essentially Samson was able to capture these. Some people think it's jackals, and just because they travel in packs, and the Bible isn't always clear in terms of the precise language. But the idea that he would do that and tie that torch and then put it into, really for the purpose of destroying their fields. And this was, in Samson's mind, a very good way to sort of get all of these people back, the Philistine people. And is certainly going to do a lot of destruction, as we see in verse 5. It says, when he set fire to the torches, he releases the foxes into the standing grain of the Philistines, thus burning up both the shocks and the standing grain, along with the vineyards and groves. In other words, he really had it out for these guys, because not only is he going after their grain, but he's also went after their vineyards and their groves. And of course, this is a very, very more agriculture time. The idea that we have a lot of transport today where we can transport food all over the country, all over the world. This creates an immediate hardship when you destroy all of the crops in one area. And a shock is really a stack of sheaves. So basically you have people going in there and harvesting the wheat and bringing it together and bundling up for a later time in which they will be collected, loaded on carts and taken, really the wheat being processed. And again, Arthur E. Kundal and Leon Morris in their commentary on the Judges and Ruth say that Samson, in setting their fire to their crops and so forth, was a common method of retaliation or revenge in the ancient world, is really to go after their agriculture. And if you'll remember, sometime later, 2 Samuel 14, 30 through 31, Absalom did the same thing. Remember when he wanted to see the king and he told Joab, his commander, and Joab never got around to it? Well, he got his attention when Absalom set his fields on fire as well. And so he knew exactly how to get them, and he probably knew that this was really going to stir these people up. Samson probably knew that he was a judge over God's people, but he probably didn't know how it was going to play out, in which he would essentially break the yoke of Philistine oppression. He seems to just sort of be going about things his own way. In other words, it doesn't seem like there's some plan figured out by him as far as, okay, here's what's going to happen. I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that. But he just sort of seems to be acting at his own whims. And really, ultimately, what's going to happen is the Philistines are going to be defeated. Any questions before we get to verse 6? Okay? It says, then the Philistines said, who is this? Or I'm sorry, who did this? And they said, Samson, the son-in-law of the Timnite, because he took his wife and gave her to the companions. So the Philistines came up and burned her and her father with fire. And so we think about extreme actions. And we talked about this earlier in chapter 14, where that was a threat that the Philistines made to Samson's wife with that riddle. The idea is, you better come up with the answer to this riddle, or we're going to burn you with fire. And so this really, the idea is something that's really tied to ancient societies, more so outside of the Israelites, and it's just really a form of punishment. In other words, if you don't give us what we want, here's what you have to look forward in store. So we can either do this the easy way, you give us what we want, or we're going to give this to you. And so this would certainly be something that would have been, we would consider very barbaric, but this would be something for ancient peoples commonplace. So,
Dad, quick question. That doesn't mean that they killed them, though, that they just burned them?
Well, it sounds like essentially they're in their home and they're surrounded by people and they torched the place
okay.
with them in there. Yeah. So, it very much, were burnt alive in there. That's every indication, not only from what we see in scripture, but really looking outside of that and sort of recognizing that. I went to, trying to think of the reference that I went to, looking that up, but it was, it's an online reference I use all the time. I have to look at my chapter 16 notes, I could tell you. But I'm drawing a blank what that is. I hate when that happens. I'll have to get that for you later. But anyway, that's where I got the reference in relation to that. So obviously the Philistines aren't happy. Samson was able to really devastate their crops, and the Philistines obviously are very upset about this. And so really they essentially, knowing that there was a tie to Samson, the idea that, okay, is because of you guys and what you did, you're going to pay the price. And so basically they extracted it from Samson's wife that was given to his companion and father in his father's house. And they really are going to pay Samson back in this way, is really to take out, his loved one. And I want to stop there and really think about this. Now Samson is acting in revenge. And Ricky talked a little bit about that. And this is not necessarily saying that this is what God wanted him to do. It's kind of goes back to the fact that Samson went after a Philistine wife. It's not what God wanted. It was not supposed to happen under the law of Moses, but Samson did it anyway. It doesn't mean that God overlooked it. Simply when we read that, the idea is God used what Samson did, what he shouldn't have done, using the revenge really to be able to break the back of the oppression of the Philistines over them. And I want to ask today, when we think about it, we are in the new covenant. Is it okay for Christians to take revenge against those who have wronged us? Why or why not?
Well, no, vengeance was God's.
Okay.
We're supposed to pray for them, do good to those that do evil to you, which is hard,
Right.
When people say nasty, wretched things to you and do things to you, it's very hard. You can be angry, but you gotta be angry in a good way. You can't. It's sinful to. That's not a Christian.
Right.
To get back even and stuff.
Yeah.
Which I've seen many people that's done evil things to me. I've seen bad things happen to them after they've done it and stuff, but you gotta be careful too, not to be happy when their calamity comes too. Me and my aunts talked about this before.
Right.
When they have a calamity for, whatever they've done to you, or maybe it's not even that, but
Right.
something happens bad in their life, you go, you
Right.
can't be like
Right.
that, and that's very hard to do. You
Right.
gotta watch that. So, God calls us, and that's a hard part about being a Christian, not to
Well,
fight.
because
and
we live our lives in a different manner than the world, and so everything that we do is geared from really following what the Word of God says. So we live and do things a lot different than the world, and if we are consistent, that's how we are going to make a difference in the world, because we're essentially showing the world a better way. I want us to look at Romans chapter 12, because I think this is exactly where we need to be. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time talking about this subject, but I want us to recognize really what the scripture has to say here in the New Testament. Romans 12, we want to read 17 through 21. If somebody, when you get there, if you'd like to read that for us, Romans 12, 17 through 21.
Never pay back evil for evil to anyone. Respect what is right in the sight of all men. If possible, so far as it depends on you, be at peace with all men. Never take your own revenge, beloved, but leave room for the wrath of God, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. But if your enemy is hungry, feed him, and if he is thirsty, give him a drink, for in so doing you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good.
Very good. So the idea is that don't be overcome by evil. If you're overcome by evil, you're going to essentially, have revenge back to them. You're going to do to them. And of course, we are to, the golden rule tells us that we are to do unto others as we'd like them to do to us, Matthew 7:12. But you probably heard the saying that two wrongs do not make a right. And so as tempting as it would be to really give somebody back what they gave to you, the idea is that's just not how Christians are supposed to operate. And what the scripture tells us is that really the place of revenge doesn't belong to us. Who does it belong to?
God.
It's God's prerogative alone. And so this would have been comforting to Christians because Christians suffer persecution. They have people doing evil and mean things to them. We went to the book of Revelation. We've seen how Christians were persecuted. Peter talks about persecution. And essentially when Christians are persecuted, that spirit of saying, well, I want to get them back for all of the evil and the hurt that they've done to me. And we've got to recognize that essentially that vengeance belongs to the Lord. And the thing about it is that it is going to be perfect. And if you extract vengeance on somebody else, you are really doing something that does not belong to you. In other words, if it's God's prerogative, then we have no right or authority to do that. And really, we're acting contrary to our best interest because God knows us. He knows how we think, our emotions, all that. He knows everything about us. And essentially, he said, don't worry about if somebody wrongs you in terms of what they've done. I'm not talking about if somebody breaks in your house, don't call the police, whatever. But the idea that you're going to extract personal vengeance. And so the idea is God is the one that is perfectly suited to extract vengeance. Cindy.
Another verse on that line that I found is Matthew 5:38 to 48. And do you want me to?
Sure.
So this is Jesus talking, so it's Sermon on the Mount, I believe, in that Matthew chapter 5.
Yeah.
So within Sermon on the Mount, he says, you have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth.
Right.
But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also.
Yeah.
And if someone wants to sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. If someone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. You have heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be sons of the Father in heaven. He causes the sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain to the righteous and the unrighteous. If you love those who love you, what reward do you get?
Sure.
Don't even the tax collectors do that. And if you greet only your brothers, what are you doing more than others? Don't even the pagans do that. Be perfect, therefore, as your Father in heaven is perfect.
I think there's looking at that, the idea is really Jesus shows us a better way. The perfection, of course, has to do with being complete like your Father. And the idea is God really, we see everything, the idea that he loves the world, he wants to save the world, he wants to give forgiveness to the world. And the idea is as Christians, we should have sort of the same mindset as God in terms of dealing with others. We should recognize, Jesus, God loved the world so much he gave us his only son. The idea that we're loving our enemies, which really, if you think about it, if you love your enemies, you pray for your enemies, that's really going to be a barrier or a prevention of you essentially doing evil to them. In other words, you're taking what they're doing, you're praying for them, and you're essentially wanting to change things in regard to them without really the idea of saying, well, they did me wrong, and so, now I'm going to give them a taste of their medicine. Yeah.
Well, go to mouths. Just like, you should, you're helping someone, you should go over, to help them and describe that.
Yeah, well, he's talking about, so in the context, one of the things that the Romans who were their oppressors did was when they came to your community, and they came with all of their army gear and packs and everything like that, when they came to town, it's like, oh, yeah, go ahead and grab my pack, and you grab his pack, and essentially you carry our stuff until we sort of pass through the town or whatever, and they had no choice, okay? And Jesus essentially saying if they force you to essentially carry 1 mile, be willing to carry it another mile. In other words, the first one is forced upon you, and Jesus is saying, make it a point to go a second mile.
Okay, well, that was back then, is that what about today?
Well, I'm just saying, the application, obviously there's an application today, but, you know, in the exact.
To me, that's something like if you're, you know, somebody, you know, asks you for like maybe like study or something, I don't know,
Yeah.
some, helping somebody, you go extra.
Well,
you
it's
know.
basically do more than what's expected. So in
Yeah.
other words, if you're compelled to do something, the court compels you to do something, whatever it is, and you say, you know what, not only am I gonna do it with court, but I'm also going to do whatever it is. So we have to come up with the scenarios, but essentially the idea that you're doing more than what's expected. And there must be something significant about that, because the idea is it is going to show people a different light. It's going to show people that you're my disciples, you know, and the fact that Jesus did more than what should have been expected from him. Nothing should have been expected, and yet he leaves the throne of glory, he puts on a robe of flesh, he puts up with all the insults and everything, and essentially goes to the cross, really shows Jesus going the extra mile many times over. So, yeah.
And turn the cheek, you know, if we got to defend yourself, if somebody just jumps on you, so
Well, yeah.
that's kind of saying don't fight or.
Right, so it's a matter of understanding. So like we talked about, somebody slaps you on the cheek, you go ahead and turn the other. It's not saying if somebody starts beating you a pulp, you just sit there and take it. I mean, if you don't understand context, you're gonna get beat up. But, you know, the idea is it's really about insult. So if somebody slapped you on one cheek, that was the idea that they were insulting you.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea is
That's
that,
what my note said, was the original translation's like the back of a hand.
Sure.
Not a intent to physically harm, but to insult. And
right, it is more of an insult. And so you turn, not the idea of somebody cold cocks you on one side and you say, oh.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really about understanding that, or you're going to get beat up, is what I'm saying. But I mean, there's a lot of things there that really says, you know, you don't have to settle the score. You should essentially be willing to endure some things for the sake of being a disciple of Jesus. Why? Because you're showing people that you're a disciple of Jesus. You're showing them that you don't react and respond in the same way that other people do. If you're a disciple of Jesus and as a Christian somebody insults you, you should not essentially say, well, I'm offended by that. But the idea is we should not essentially say, okay, well, you've insulted me, I'm going to insult you back. And so the idea of turning the other cheek, that you're willing to endure another insult for Jesus. So.
yeah, because to me, defending yourself from an onslaught is different than you are out of danger and now it's payback.
Right. And so I think, you know, there's a lot of things that when we start to look at discipleship of Jesus, I mean, the idea starts there with the Beatitudes. The idea is this is what I'm looking for to be a disciple. If you're going to be a disciple, you know, blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. The idea of these are all the kind of characteristics and qualities that Jesus is looking for in disciples, and all these things have to do with being a disciple of Jesus. Remember that Jesus is really preparing the people for the new covenant. It's going to be a lot different than the old covenant and the way things were done. But I would like to come back to this, and we look at the idea that we should not exact personal revenge. The idea that two wrongs never make a right. The idea that this is always God's prerogative. And so the idea is we must trust God with essentially the fact that if somebody does us wrong, and I'm not really talking about criminally, ideas is you have courts, you're perfectly allowed if somebody steals your property, for them to be caught and prosecuted, but it's really about personal wrongs, that those really belong to God. And that's a good place for us to leave them, because as we see with Samson is that revenge begets revenge. Okay, in other words, you know, you think you're going to extract a revenge to a certain point, and then you're going to be done. Well, that might be good for you or what you think, but the Philistines aren't going to be done. And so it really isn't a good situation there, but God is going to work through that, essentially to accomplish His will. Okay?
I find it interesting that God chooses this path to use Samson at all.
Yeah.
I mean, he is an impulsive guy.
Yeah.
I mean,
He seems very immature too. I mean,
Yeah,
he might be a strong guy, but yeah.
But I mean, his weakness seems to be the ladies.
Absolutely.
I mean, he's got this Timnite wife,
Yeah.
then in 16, he's
Yeah.
with a harlot, and then Delilah enters the picture, which
moved on, yeah.
ultimately is his downfall.
Right.
So,
Yeah, and we talked a little bit about this last time. The idea is that it's difficult to read this book, or read this part about Samson and get over to Hebrews chapter 11:25, and he's one of the hero Hall of Fame. And like, how is that possible? But I think the thing is that, you know, we all we have to do is look at any of the lives of those that are recorded in the Old Testament as well. I mean, David made some pretty substantial mistakes, but it seems to be the same way. And the idea is that overall, Samson was a man of faith. Now we're not talking, we're only talking about things really pertinent in terms of, you know, the Philistines. So we might get the impression that he doesn't really seem like a man of faith, although we can see that later he's going to pray out to God and God is going to answer his prayer. And so either the Hebrew writer is glossing over all of these things, which I don't believe. In other words, let's not get into the particulars, or the fact that he truly was a man of faith, and that overall, in terms of his life, you know, he acted in faith. And as difficult as it is to read that and think this is a head scratcher, we're really getting, you know, we don't know that we're getting every bit of information, like, you know, Samson, was he praying? Was he, you know, what was he doing? Was he into the Word of God? What all the other things? In other words, the writer may just be giving us what we need to sort of fill this overall picture of Samson, which to us, the only thing impressive about Samson is he's a strong guy. That's really the only thing that you see. And, you know, the idea that all of this compulsiveness and seems like immaturity, God's going to use instead, even at that, to accomplish His will. So,
Well, I think a Christian fails to understand, a lot of Christians. God made Samson to be a fighting machine, to clear out the Philistines.
Right.
And, you know, when, you know, getting revenge and stuff, that's what Samson was created to do, you know. It was, you know, wrong, you know, but, you know, back then it was a tooth, eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, too, you know.
well, yeah, and that was under the law of Moses, that whatever injustice, under the criminal justice system they had, whatever was done to you according to the law of Moses, that would be done to you. It wasn't really about personal revenge, but that had to do within their
The
civil
scope of,
law.
you know,
There's civil law. So if somebody did this to you, boom, boom, this is what's going to happen to them. It's the same weight.
but when you're talking about faith with Samson, just exactly what are you getting in the fighting business as far as the Philistines?
We're just talking about, was he really a man who lived for God?
Well, he did what God called him to do. I
Right.
mean,
What I was just saying, we're in the big picture of things, he accomplished what God wanted to do.
God
It's when
wanted
we
to
get
clear
sort
out
of down into
Philistines,
the
yeah.
details where it
that was basically his job, was to kill Philistines. I mean,
Yeah.
to clear them out. They
Right.
were increasing.
Right.
God seen that, and God created,
Right.
you know, Samson to be the human machine to clear
Right.
them out.
Yeah, right. In the end, that's essentially what's going to happen. It could be a one-man army. How Samson went about it is what we're talking about.
Yeah.
God could have used a whole different way in order to bring about the same thing without Samson really getting involved with all these back and forth and the revenge and all that. In other words, God didn't need really the immaturity and the impulsiveness of Samson to do that. He could have used a different way.
Yeah.
And it's just, he used what Samson, you know, went through, what he was doing. he used the impulsiveness of Samson and his immaturity to accomplish what he was gonna accomplish, and Samson was gonna be the one-man army to essentially defeat the Philistines. So,
Yeah, and a lot of people try to question that about God, but God's perfect, you know.
That's right.
God's ways are higher than our ways, so
sure,
nothing God does is a mistake. We make the mistakes
Right.
and stuff. So, but yeah, so the book, well, not the book, but the Samson story is very, and a lot of people mistake that because they think they're allowed to fight because
Right.
Samson did that, but that
yeah.
what they're not realizing that was what he was called to do.
Well, I think that's what
the
he, about that lady in jail taking a tent stake with a hammer. You're gonna go Old Testament like, well, look at, here's somebody that was a woman of faith.
Oh, the one that took a stake to that guy's
Yeah,
head. Yeah.
gave him a splitting headache. I mean, are we supposed to,
Wham!
yeah. And you say, well, it was done in the Old Testament by somebody who was a person of God, you know, so, I mean, that's really a stretch.
Well, back then, in the Old Testament, there was different than it is these days.
Yeah,
You know?
right. So we gotta be careful with, sort of saying, oh, it was done here, so we'll do it. So let's pick up and move on so we get, two way down here. Verse 8, talking about Samson, he said, he struck them ruthlessly with a great slaughter, and he went down and lived in the cleft of the rock at Etham. And so the idea of being merciless and the sort of the brutality, and the idea is he's not happy with these people, these Philistines, and so he essentially let them have it. And the idea of a slaughter is sort of a killing of a great number of people. This is exactly what Samson did. And then it says he went down and he lived in the cleft of the rock. So we're talking about perhaps a cave. And this place is in a place called Edom, which means a place of birds of prey. And it is somewhere in western Judah. And there's where he goes. So he accomplishes this. This is kind of interesting. You know, we're probably not taught, told everything that we'd like to know about this. We're just sort of said, well, he went and did this, and then he went here. And that was pretty much it. Okay, let's see. I think we can sneak some more in here. So let's read 9 through 13. Jenna, would you be willing to read that?
Then the Philistines went up and camped in Judah and spread out in Lehi. And the men of Judah said, why have you come up against us? And they said, we have come up to bind Samson in order to do to him as he did to us. Then 3,000 men of Judah went down to the cleft of the rock of Edom and said to Samson, do you not know that the Philistines are rulers over us? What then is this that you have done to us? And he said to them, as you did to me, so I have done to them. And they said to him, we have come down to bind you so that we may give you into the hands of the Philistines. And Samson said to them, swear to me that you will not kill me. So they said to him, no, but we will bind you fast and give you into their hands. Yet surely we will not kill you. Then they bound him with 2 new ropes and brought him up from the rock.
Okay. So the story continues here. And it talks about the Philistines, verse 9. Then the Philistines went up and camped in Judah and spread out Lehi. The Hebrew word there, the idea of the warriors spreading out. They're not happy. Samson has just extracted a great slaughter. They've got their warriors, they're in place, and they've really come to take hold of Samson. And this place, Lehi, means jawbone. Boy, I wonder where they got that name from. Well, it's going to be where Samson is going to use a jawbone, and he's going to kill 1,000 Philistines. But it's called Lehi now, before the event and not after the event. How do we explain that?
Because it broke.
What's that?
Because it broke.
No. How do we explain the fact that it's called jawbone before the great event of the battle with the jawbone happened?
I was gonna say, does it have anything to do with what you said just a little bit ago about where the cave was like next to birds of prey, and I don't know, maybe
The what?
where Samson was in the cleft of the thing, and you said the meaning of it was like birds of prey or something.
Yeah. Well, I don't think there's a direct connection with that.
Yeah, I think it's because the writer wrote it after the event.
Right. So we're talking about something that we probably don't hear very often. It's called a prolepsis. And this happens sometimes in the Bible, and I'm gonna explain that. This is probably a prolepsis, and the Britannica.com explains it as a figure of speech in which a future act or development is represented as if already accomplished or existing. So in other words, this place where the Philistines had camped and spread out in was not originally known as Lehi, but after Samson, killed 1,000 men with the jawbone, it was known then. But the idea is we're moving it back, we're putting it here, even though it doesn't become that until later.
Probably
Well,
because
there's
his
many
readers would have known it as Lehi, and he
Right.
wants it to be understood.
Right, so later readers would only know this place as Lehi. So you bring up a good point. They would only know it as Lehi. So the idea that, okay, we're just calling it that now, and so it had been after the event. Yeah. Did somebody have their hand over here? Okay,
You're talking as a figure of speech.
Yes.
Can it be like a word like Jews, and later on means Israel?
Well, it was Israel and then Jews, but we're really talking about events that are sometimes placed before. So I'm thinking about sometime with Cain, and I'm trying to think of another example. But the idea is that the writer does this for his convenience, really, and for those who would read afterwards. It's just better to put that information there than sort of have to give some kind of explanation later about what's changed with it. And so sometimes people that are critics of the Bible will maybe bring up something like this, say, well, if the battle didn't happen here, it was named Jawbone later, why is it calling it Jawbone here? But this is a figure of speech. It is something well known. It is used in other kind of secular writings. The Bible is not prohibited from using the same sort of things in this way.
So
as long as
it's
we
called
understand.
jawbone both times, or
Well, it wasn't known as Jawbone until the big battle happened later, in
Okay.
verse 15 through 17.
So
It's
it was
like, for
not
example-
known as Lehi previous to the event.
Right.
Yeah, it's like, for example, and I'm just making stuff up because I can't think of a real example.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm sorry.
But like, let's say there's a town on the edge of the river that used to run in Chicago, and it was called, I don't know, Smithtown, right? And the fire burned through Smithtown at the time. But none of us have ever heard of Smithtown, and I'm telling you about it, and I'm like, it's that part of Chicago by the river is where it burned through. I didn't call it Smithtown, I called it Chicago, but back then it
Yeah.
was Smithtown.
Yeah,
But you would have only known it when I was writing if
Right.
I said the fire burned through Chicago.
right.
Okay, I know where that is.
Okay.
So the Bible writers will do that. I wish I should have probably wrote down some examples, but this is not a surprise, and the Bible critics will use
Well, I'm gonna look
this.
it up because I got
Okay.
this here.
PRO, you got your pencil handy? PRO?
PROLEPSS.
SIS. There you go. Okay, so let's pick up and go. We'll try to get through these next few verses. It says, verse 10, the men of Judah said, "Why have you come up against us?" And they said, "We have come up to bind Samson in order to do to him as he has done to us." So they're separating really Samson from the Israelites. Why they just don't come in there and say, "You know what? We're just going to let you have it." I mean, they're the ones that are, in control. They're the ones that have power over the Israelites, but they obviously they're not going to do anything to these Israelites. They're just demanding that they turn over Samson, and so they want to take Samson into their control, and they want to make him pay dearly, that is with his life, for what he has done.
What's interesting to me is that all through here, each party is saying, "I'm gonna do to you what you did to me."
Right.
But each party, when they do it, does above and beyond.
Right, up an ante every time. So you did this to me, all right, we're doing this to you. Well, you did, okay, and I'm going to do this. And I get
think
that.
about it initially. I mean, Samson's wife got given to somebody else. Well, that stinks.
Yeah.
So he burns the whole village's crops. The whole village didn't
Right,
do it.
right,
Okay, well now they say, well, you burned the whole village's crops, so we're going to burn your wife and his father. And he's
Right.
like, oh, well, okay, then I'm going to kill the whole village.
right,
Like it's just going up.
right. And I think it makes an excellent point, the idea of what's wrong with personal revenge. Because when you go down that road, you know, the idea, think about road rage. Isn't that really what that turns into? The idea that maybe you did something you shouldn't have, and somebody said, okay, fine. And they do something, and then, you know, go back and forth until whatever happens, happens. And it's really, the idea is like, I'm not gonna put up with that. You know, if you're gonna do this to me, then I'm gonna do this to you. But it really seems to tell us, you know, this is really a reason why you don't want to do revenge, because that's really where it's gonna go.
And then you're perpetrating evil on somebody.
Well,
It's
yeah.
not truly payback, you're perpetrating it.
Right,
raising
and
the
you're really encouraging, really, for them to do at least at the same level you've done, if not more. And usually you do more because you want to stifle this person doing anything back to you. By upping the ante, this guy's got to think twice whether or not he's going to do something, because it's going to come back to him that much more so. So.
Not the definition of peacemaker.
Yeah. So I'm we'll have to stop there for now, because I want to spend a little bit of time with this next verse 11 there. So does anybody have any comments or questions?
So just one last thing,
Sure.
which maybe we could look at next week.
Sure.
Is thinking about this towards Philippians 2, first part of Philippians 2 through about verse 11. And what it talks about there is how Christ was God and yet chose to empty himself and
Right.
and put aside
Right.
his rights, put
Right.
aside what was due him
Right.
in order to reach us, and that's what he expects of us, is
Right. Well, I think
put
that's just,
aside
right,
what's
it's a powerful testimony of selflessness, because what is our human nature? Be selfish, and that's really, at times, and we'll come back to it, but, you know, Paul is really going to have to work with congregations that he's dealing with because of that. The idea is if you're gonna be a follower of Jesus Christ, there's a tremendous lesson here that you have to incorporate into your life that is supposed to define your life and really make you like Christ. So yeah, I think that's an excellent passage there. We'll come back to that. So we better sign off. So I want to thank those who will be watching this video sometime later. God bless you. And a week from today, we plan to have another video.